On November 10th, 1975, 29 crew members were lost when the Edmund Fitzgerald went down in a storm on Lake Superior. Today, we remember them and reflect on the 50th anniversary of the tragedy. My name is Aimee Bachari, and I am the Education Director at the Steamship Historical Society of America. And today I'll be speaking with Mark Sprang, the Archivist for the Historical Collections of the Great Lakes at Bowling Green State University, about the Edmund Fitzgerald.
If you was to ask any sailor if they would name one or two ships that they would rather ride on in a storm, the Fitzgerald's name would always come up because she was well made, and she was a big ship and was noted for riding good seas and all aspects of a storm,
Built in Michigan in 1958 by Great Lakes Engineering for the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was truly a vessel for its time.
The longest freighter on the Great Lakes, the Edmund Fitzgerald, also makes Toledo a regular port of call. The vessel is 729 feet long and can carry more than 20,000 tons of iron ore. More than 4.5 million tons of iron ore have passed through the Toledo port in a single season.
There is that line in the Lightfoot song, and it's a big quote of how Lake Superior never gives up her dead. It's not actually folklore. So because the water in Lake Superior is so cold and so many parts of it are so anoxic that the bacteria that would normally cause a body to bloat and float to the surface can't survive. So they don't float to the surface like you would get in warmer waters.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name is Mark Sprang. I'm Archivist at Bowling Green State University with our Great Lakes Historical Collections. I do just about anything related to the maritime history of the Great Lakes region. I do processing of collections. I do appraisals and donor relations. I do lots of reference and research questions, outreach, lots of assistance with publication for people doing broadcasts, documentaries, books, articles, interviews, even like presentations at local historical societies. So it keeps me very busy.
The Edmund Fitzgerald story gets a lot of attention, and I think it gets a lot of attention because of sort of the mystery of why the ship went down. But do you have any other thoughts on why this particular shipwreck does get so much attention?
I mean, I know the song is a big part of it because that was the following year and it became sort of a smash hit. So it spread through popular culture like almost no other shipwreck has, maybe other than the Titanic, just because of its the scale. But I think the recency bias too, because it was 1975 and that's not a time people would think about a shipwreck with all hands lost, especially for, there's still sailors around. I mean, they're retired now, but they remember it. For a lot of them, it was their friends. They knew each other. And because the Great Lakes shipping community is such more tight knit in terms of numbers and number of sailors and things like that, I think it's just, so it had a much more personal impact. I think that's why, because the community was so small. I mean, it was only a couple hundred to a few hundred ships at most at the time. So losing a whole one with everybody was a big deal. The previous large shipwreck on the lakes was 1966. The Daniel J. Morrell sank in Lake Huron, but they know what caused that, and one person survived out of the whole crew. In this case, they just disappeared, no remains, no one floated up, no survivors. So I think that's probably the other part is the recency bias, the mystery of not really knowing what happened for sure. There's all these competing theories with various levels of credence to them. And then having a pop culture song written about it, which is not something that usually happens for a shipwreck in modern times. It was very common, in the 19th, 18th, early 20th centuries to do that, but it tended to be more focused on that area. The song was known by people from this is where the ship was based or where the captain was based or where it was built. So it just had a bunch of coincidental things to make it the big phenomenon that it is.
And the woman I worked for had called me and said, what ship was Tom on? And I said, the Fitzgerald. She said, did you hear the news? And I said, no. And she said, well, don't leave your house. She said, somebody will come and be with you. I never heard from the people Fitzgerald till, was it the next time I called and they wouldn't give me any information at all even.
The Fitzgerald gets a lot of attention in our region because 7 out of the 29 crew were from the Toledo area, including the captain, who was literally on his last trip before retirement.
There was some changes made to regulations, though, after the sinking, right? How would they even make those recommendations for changes if they can't accurately pinpoint what caused the sinking in the first place?
There's at least a few things. Few ships were already piloting the use of survival suits for the crew before that, but that became mandatory. By 1980 or so, Loran C started to be required, but that was surpassed by GPS later. That was a requirement. That was all the vessels were required to have depth finders, which it still blows my mind that the Fitzgerald did not have a mechanical depth finder. They were still using the manual line in 1975, and they have to get annual inspections by the Coast Guard. And I believe also having to have emergency radio beacons that can be activated in an emergency so they can be located right away. There were some congressional panel recommendations and some other improvements from American Bureau of Shipping. Fortunately, there's always an upside to a shipwreck for what it's worth, but it's sort of that quote about regulations are written in blood. Like, well, yeah, we should have done these before, but now that people died, we're actually going to implement this. And a couple of years before, the Coast Guard had permitted lower freeboard and load line. So that means your vessel could sit, a few feet lower in the water. But that means also if you're washed over, it's harder to recover. So those were rescinded as well, thankfully. Because I don't know if that played a role or not, but I'm sure it didn't help that they were known for overloading. I know one of the items I sent you is a loading log from a donor, a sailor who worked on the ship in 72, 73, but you can tell it was designed for this, but they kept breaking carrying records, and it's like, well, there's a point where you're carrying too much. Because it's, well, if we get a few more 100 tons more on this trip, we'll make X dollars more. Even more confusing for me because the ship was operated by Columbia Transportation, Ogle Bay Norton Company, but owned by Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance. So they operated several ships as an investment, but had an actual shipping line, do the management and all that.
The wreck site of the Edmund Fitzgerald being, I think the only one, is it the only one in the Great Lakes that you can't dive? Because it's considered.
Well, yeah, it's for the reasons of it being a protected grave site, and it's mostly just over the line into Canadian waters as well. So you're not even allowed to sonar scan it, like a side scan. I mean, it's deep, it's 500 foot, but in the 90s, there were a couple of divers who were able to make it with the special like pressure suits like you'd see in the Abyss kind of. But yeah, I think just because of the recency and because so many people were around who were affected by it, they were able to press for that, especially from the province of Ontario government, to be like, no, you can't come here, you can't visit the site. Even just to do sonar, like shipwreck searching in Ontario waters, you have to get government permission to do it. In the US, you just go. So yeah, it is very unusual that, because it's the 50th anniversary and there's people who were like, we would love to we don't want to go down to it. We just want to scan it and see how it's deteriorating. But you can't even do that. I think enough people seem to be respecting it at this case, because the last time anyone has been to the wreck is mid-90s. So it's been 30 years. So I know a couple of people who got to go on a submersible down to it in the 90s, so they got to see it. So, but since then, people just want to know, is the water pressure, is it crushing the wreck? How does it look? They're not trying to look for remains or anything. It's just, what is the status of the ship itself?
When people talk about this, everybody talks about, they just love to argue about why the ship
Yes.
went down. And I don't think that's valuable. I think 29 people lost their lives and we should remember them. And, you know, I like talking about sort of the changes that came after it to make sure that crew members are safe in the future. But it is just such a popular ship and shipwreck.
Yeah, it
And,
is.
you know, so I think it's important to talk about. But
Yeah, because that was also, there were, you know, there was the Daniel J. Morrell sank in Lake Huron in 1966. There was a survivor. The Carl Bradley sank in, and Henry Steinbrenner both sank in Lake Michigan, one in 58 and one in 53, but there was always one or two people who made it. There was the big Armistice Day storm of 1940 on the Great Lakes, in which several ships were lost in Lake Michigan. Yeah, almost one day off from the day the Fitzgerald sank, because it was November 11th versus November 10th. And it's like, yeah, every couple of decades we get an almost identical storm at an almost identical time of year. There was one from the 9th to the 13th of 1913. That was still the biggest known storm on the Great Lakes because 12 ships were lost, about 250 sailors lost, and a bunch of ships damaged, and lots of power outages and things all over the region. So each time you see improvements in the weather forecasting, because 1913 wireless communication is still super new. I mean, and only some lake ships and fleets were adopting it. It wasn't universal. So, I mean, the Titanic was the year before, April of 1912, and that was still considered pretty new at that point. So the bomb cyclones that beeline to the Great Lakes always are either Alberta clippers, or they're a low pressure system that gets over the Rockies, hits the panhandle of Oklahoma, coalesces, and like beeline straight for us every time. They always hit a slightly different section of the lakes, but the same thing always happens. There was another one in the 90s like that. Yeah, and we can reconstruct the Fitzgerald storm because I believe that also in 1975 was when NOAA launched their first GOES satellite, so their first official weather satellite that was sending back imagery from space, so we could actually see the images. And you can actually, you have to dig a while, but you can find that sort of historical imagery on NOAA's site, which is really, really cool that you can do that. But so that's why it was so bad for the Fitzgerald, because reconstructing all the weather data and looking at it, they were in this little sort of oval of eastern Lake Superior where the wave height was the highest, the sustained winds were the highest, the precipitation was like, it was the worst possible situation because they had the whole length of Lake Superior was the fetch for the wind. Because when they left, after they left Duluth and they got the first, you know, weather advisories, the wind was from the north, so they hugged the North Shore, which totally makes sense. That's what you do to shelter from the weather. But then it switched west. So you had the whole length. And I mean, you had 20 to 25 foot waves. Captain Cooper of the Anderson, who was miles behind the Fitzgerald, said, I think we've got 30 to 35 feet going over our decks at some of these waves. So which isn't surprising for the ocean, but that's how bad the lakes can get too. And the waves are closer together here because so you're getting hit by them more quickly in succession. We have logs from not from the Fitzgerald, of course, because they're at the bottom, but from other ships that were out at the same time. So they're recording their weather data and what's happening. And even the western end of Lake Erie, when we were just getting brushed by a little arm of the storm, we were still getting 10-foot waves on the west end here. So that's how bad it was. So a lot of ships stayed in port at that time, and others that were out in the storm, the Coast Guard said, hey, well, our Coast Guard cutter's it was being fitted in Duluth. So they're like, hey, can all these freighters, can you guys go and look for them for us, which they did.
Do you think there's any possibility that you could come out and go back there and do any searching? Yeah, I don't know. Like you said, sea out there is tremendously large, Don. If you want me to, I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going out that way.
It's still fascinating that they were relying on civilians to do the search and rescue stuff, which you wouldn't think about. So yeah, there's just so much related to it in terms of regulations and Of course, there's the Lake Carriers Association. Quick plug for our collection because we have their historical records. They've been around since 1880, roughly. So they're basically the trade group that represents all the shipping companies on the lakes. So I know one of the items I sent over to you is their president's protest against the Coast Guard's report, because the Coast Guard is like, well, obviously it was these hatch clamps. And they're like, no, there's no way. We've been using these for decades and haven't had any problems. There were a lot of them. There were about 60 per, I want to say 60 per hatch. I'm probably wrong. And 21 hatches. And you had to, the deckhands had to do each one of those. So they wouldn't always do every single one, or they would do it as they were on the trip. But one or two of them being, not all the way down out of 60 is not going to loosen the hatch enough to make a difference. The captain had 40 years of experience, Captain McSorley. So he knew what he was doing. But they did interview prior captains for the Coast Guard, Board of Inquiry, and stuff too. So it's interesting to get their perspectives on what happened. And surprisingly, the Wikipedia article, I don't always recommend Wikipedia as a source, but they actually do a good job. Whoever the authors have been, they don't take a side, and they just present the major theories and like, here's the different ones and what they think happened, because the Coast Guard had theirs and the NTSB had theirs. A book that came out in late 90s, 2000s by one of the guys at Great Lakes Engineering Works who designed it, did his own. There's another one there's another one done by, a weather expert. And then you have more general ones. It's like any popular history topic. You have the entire spectrum of publication. So you have, very serious, academically rigorous to sort of pop history type stuff. And they're not always differentiated between which is which. So, and you're right about, you mentioned the shipwreck preservation. So there's some great ones in all of the lakes, but Superior has the ones that are the best preserved. We are a diving mecca to an extent, but I think because of the water temperatures, people they love to do more shipwreck diving in like the Caribbean or the Mediterranean, somewhere where it's warmer, right? Because Lake Superior, even in the summer, is barely into the 60s, if that. Lake Erie, the visibility is too bad. But, I know in the lake system, we have at least 3 or 4 schooners that sank in the 19th century where the masts are still standing. There's a bunch in Lake Superior where some of the paint's still on it. Intact windows. It depends on how they sank, right? If they sank violently, it's all busted up. But some of them just went gently to the bottom.
Can we talk a bit about the materials that you have related to the Edmund Fitzgerald specifically?
Biggest thing is the original builder's plans from Great Lakes Engineering Works. They only built 2 ships after the Fitzgerald before they closed in the early 60s. So it's a big deal. So we have pretty much a full set, because not really anything was modified before it sank in 75. So over 17, 18 years, it didn't really go through that much change. A photograph collection, some of which are original, some are copies. There's kind of a conglomeration, as many of our photo files are. Of course, the newspaper collection, we have a couple of films of it. One is a promotional film done by Willis Jeep and the Toledo Port Authority together in like 1960. They were promoting the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway and how great it's going to be for the Great Lakes region. It only kind of was.
Cargo of all descriptions long has been transported by water from one country to another. Today, moving freight by ships to and from the United States is big business. And when we speak of foreign shipping, we usually think of ports at New York, Baltimore, New Orleans, or San Francisco. Our story starts at the Dwight D. Eisenhower Lock, one of the 7 new locks in the St. Lawrence Seaway that permit larger ocean-going vessels to reach Toledo. It is near Messina, New York.
It was known as the Toledo Express because Superior, Wisconsin to Toledo, Ohio was its most common route. So it did that hundreds and hundreds of times over its career. A few things we have copies of, but they're not. There's many copies out there, like the Coast Guard's report, widely panned, the National Transportation Safety Board's report, little information on the recovery of the ship's bell in the mid-1990s. It was replaced with a new bell engraved with the crew members' names. We have a couple of nice little taconite samples, which is the basically pelletized iron that it would usually carry Of course, we have a copy of Gordon Lightfoot's sheet music for the song, and then some other material like the specifications, the paper the designers presented at the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers about here's the design of our new ship, because at the time of its launch, it was what was called Queen of the Lakes, which is the title given to the longest ship on the lakes generally. So it wasn't that long before it was surpassed by a Canadian ship by just a little bit. The current largest ship is 1,013 feet long, so it's stuck in the lakes. There's no way it can get out. So there's a lot related to that, and the sort of machinery design and inspections and American Bureau of Shipping approvals and that sort of thing. So there's quite a bit.
So you had sent a couple pictures that I found especially intriguing, and they were of passenger accommodations and a passenger dining room. And I had never seen pictures of the interior of this ship at all, and honestly didn't know that there would have been. I know that on, most cargo vessels, especially ocean-going cargo vessels, there would have been small accommodations for passengers, and they would have carried, 4 to 12 or something like that. But I had never really thought about that on the Great Lakes. And so when you sent these pictures, I was like, oh my gosh, that is so interesting. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, how common it would have been for people to travel on a ship like the Edmund Fitzgerald.
So the flagships of a number of fleets usually had some sort of passenger quarters and like an owner's quarters / lounge that they could use on a whim, basically. If they have business interests at the other end of that ship's regular trip, sometimes they would just ride the boat instead. And you could still, especially until the COVID years, it was a lot easier. You could still get passenger passage on a number of the freighters on the Great Lakes. So, they'd have a special steward who just catered to you and your guests. And, it's the same thing. It's only a handful of people. Now you can only do it if it's like a raffle or something. Because, post 9/11, it was already starting to be restricted. But then the companies took advantage during the COVID years to like kind of permanently restrict passenger access. Yeah, in the Fitzgerald case, they had sort of state-of-the-art cabins. But the one picture you'll probably show of the guest stateroom, you can actually kind of see the curve of the side of the cabin there. So you had nice passenger staterooms. They probably used the officer's mess, I would guess, to eat in because it was fancier. You could wine and dine the big wigs while you were at port unloading. Not loading, maybe loading too, but usually you were at a big sort of gravity dock situation. It wouldn't have been as easy to do that. But a lot of times in the earlier years, it was usually family members especially of the captain, bring the wife and kids along for a trip or something along those lines. And of course, the more recent you get, the more difficult that was to do. Prior to the sort of standard Great Lakes freighter design, tons of the ships on the Great Lakes were sort of they were passenger and package freight. So you had the freight deck and you had a passenger deck on them. So that was more common. And then once trains and automobiles came along, that kind of really slowed it down. So the passenger trade on the lakes now is very light compared to what it was, at least on the Lakers. There are a few cruise ships that do operate here.
We would like to thank Mark Sprang for taking the time to chat with us today on the 50th anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald and to share information about the materials related to the ship in his collection. You can find links for more information in the video description. Until next time, fair winds and following seas.